You have to promise me. I promise. I will protect her. Always. I will not let anything happen to her. I promise.
The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning in late October, tucked between a water bill and a takeout menu printed on thick cream cardstock with gold lettering that caught the gray Brooklyn light filtering through Clara Weston's studio window. She read it 3 times, standing at her kitchen counter in paint-stained sweatpants, coffee going cold beside her hand. Nadia Harlow and Rocco Valenti request the honor of your presence at Stonehaven Estate, Vermont. Clara set the card down carefully, the way you set down something that might break if handled wrong. She had known Nadia Russo as she still thought of her for 10 years. They had met as freshmen at Pratt, 2 girls who showed up to orientation with too many art supplies and not enough confidence, and had spent the next decade filling the gaps in each other's lives. Nadia had been the one who talked Clara into her first gallery show. Clara had been the one who held Nadia's hand through 2 heartbreaks in 1 very bad year. They were the kind of friends who existed in each other's lives the way breathing exists, not something you notice until it stopped. She had heard about Rocco Valenti only in pieces. A businessman, Nadia had said. Real estate. Development. He owns a lot of property in New England. She had said it the way people describe weather, factual and distant, like it had nothing to do with her. Clara had asked to meet him twice and been told both times that the timing was not right. Now they were getting married. She picked up her phone and typed, "I will be there, wouldn't miss it for anything." "Are you happy?" 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "So happy," Nadia wrote back. "I really need you there, Clara, more than you know." Clara stared at the words for a long moment. More than you know was not how happy people described their weddings. She told herself she was overthinking it. She was an illustrator of children's books. She spent her days drawing brave mice and kind bears in worlds where the right thing always happened in the end. It made her, she had been told more than once, somewhat impractical about reality. She booked a car service for Friday morning and spent Thursday evening trying to pack sensibly for 3 days in Vermont in November, which mostly meant failing to decide between 2 identical black dresses and eventually bringing both. She did not sleep well. The driver was a quiet man named Gerald, who had been doing the New York to Vermont run for 11 years and had opinions about the best rest stop on the interstate that he shared without being asked. Clara sat in the back seat with her sketchbook open on her lap and drew nothing for the first 2 hours. Just watched the city dissolve into suburbs, dissolve into the kind of countryside that feels like a different country. The GPS took them off the main highway around hour 4 onto a 2-lane road that wound through pine forest so dense it blocked the November sky. The light changed, went flat and gray and close. Cell service dropped from 2 bars to 1 to nothing. Gerald glanced in the rearview mirror. Pretty remote for a wedding. "They like their privacy," Clara said. He made a sound that suggested he had thoughts about that, but was too professional to share them. The road narrowed. The trees pressed closer. And then at the end of a long gravel drive, flanked by iron-tipped fencing that ran as far as the eye could see in both directions, Stonehaven Estate appeared. It rose from the forest the way things rise in nightmares, gradually and then all at once. Dark stone, 4 stories of it, with peaked towers at each corner, and windows that caught the last light of afternoon like watching eyes. The architecture was somewhere between Gothic and fortress, the kind of building that had been designed not just to shelter its inhabitants, but to remind everyone else that they were outside, and the people inside preferred it that way. Ivy climbed the eastern face in dense black tangles, stripped bare by November. The iron gate at the entrance was easily 12 feet tall. "Beautiful," Gerald said quietly, "in the way that glaciers are beautiful." 2 men in dark suits stood at the gate. One held a tablet. The other had his hands clasped in front of him in a way that did not quite conceal the shape of something under his jacket. Clara counted 3 more men along the fence line, partially obscured by shadow. She had been to weddings with security before. A college roommate whose father was a minor politician. A corporate event that doubled as a reception. But those had been single men with earpieces checking names at a door. This was different. This was 9 men that she could see. She gave her name at the gate and was waved through after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to be uncomfortable. Gerald pulled up the gravel drive and helped her with her bag, without comment, but when she turned to say goodbye, his expression was the careful blank of a man choosing not to say what he was thinking. "You want me to wait?" he asked. She almost said yes. The word was right there. No, she said. That is okay. Thank you. He drove away quickly. Clara stood alone in the courtyard with her overnight bag and her bridesmaid dress, in a garment bag over one arm, in 6 visible security personnel, and the weight of a feeling she could not name pressing against the inside of her chest. A woman appeared at the front entrance before she could knock. 50s silver hair pulled back, severely black dress that suggested function over formality. Miss Weston, I am Mrs. Alcott. I manage the household. Please follow me. The inside of Stonehaven was the kind of wealth that had stopped trying to prove itself sometime in the previous century. Dark wood paneling, Persian rugs worn to softness by decades of footsteps, oil portraits of men with hard eyes and good suits lining the stairwell. Crystal chandeliers, real ones, not the kind that imitated crystal, but actual cut glass that fractured the lamplight into small cold rainbows on the ceiling. Voices drifted from somewhere deep in the house. Italian, fast and quiet, the kind of conversation that stops when strangers walk past. Miss Harlow is resting before dinner, Mrs. Alcott said without turning around. You will have time to change. Dinner is at 8. The rehearsal is tomorrow at 3. She led Clara up a staircase and down a corridor and stopped at a door in the east wing. The room beyond was bigger than Clara's entire Brooklyn apartment. 4-poster bed, antique writing desk, a window overlooking a sweep of lawn that ran to the tree line where the Vermont forest began its dark work of being impenetrable. Beautiful room, Clara said. Mrs. Alcott nodded once, the way people nod when they already know, and the comment is beside the point. If you need anything, press the button by the door. Dinner is formal. She left. The door did not lock. Clara stood in the middle of the room and tried to decide what the feeling was that had followed her from Brooklyn. She changed into the less complicated of the 2 black dresses and tried her phone. 1 bar. Texts were not sending. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window and thought about the fence line and the men along it and the way Gerald had driven away quickly. She found Nadia on her 3rd try in a suite at the far end of the east wing, past 2 men who watched her walk the corridor with professional attention. She knocked softly. A pause. Footsteps. The door opened. Nadia looked extraordinary. Her dark hair was already half-styled, pinned in a way that suggested a professional had been at work for hours. She was wearing a silk robe the color of champagne, and her makeup was flawless, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who had not slept in 3 days. She pulled Clara inside and closed the door, and they stood very close together in the middle of a room that smelled of expensive perfume and something underneath it that Clara recognized only as fear. You look beautiful, Clara said, because it was true. Don't, Nadia said. Her voice was quiet and precise. The walls here, they listen. Clara looked at her steadily. What does that mean? It means what it means. Nadia moved to the window, turned her back to the room, and spoke to the glass. It means I need you to understand what this place is before tomorrow. What he is. Tell me. Nadia was quiet for a moment. Outside, a security patrol moved along the fence line, 2 men in dark coats, unhurried and systematic. My father owed Rocco Valenti $3 million. The words came out flat, practiced the sound of something that had been said internally so many times it had lost its texture. A land deal that failed 4 years ago. My father made promises he could not keep, and when the deadline came, he had nothing. She paused. Rocco came to him with a solution. Clara's stomach dropped slowly like an elevator with a cut cable. You cannot be serious. Nadia turned from the window. Her eyes were dry, which was somehow worse than if she had been crying. My father signed papers in June. The marriage satisfies the debt. Rocco gets a wife from a family with old New England connections, which is useful for him politically. My father keeps his house. She said the last part without inflection. That is the arrangement. We leave right now. Clara said it quietly, but she meant every word. We pack your bag and we walk out the front gate and we call someone. Call who? Nadia's voice held something between grief and patience. 3 judges in this state have accepted Rocco's hospitality. The state police commissioner attended his father's funeral. She gestured slightly at the window at the men outside. Half the people in this building are not caterers. There are federal agencies, the FBI. There are lawyers, and there are years, and there are ways to make problems disappear that do not require anyone to go to court. Nadia sat down on the edge of the bed. If I run tonight, my father disappears. Not dramatically, not violently enough for anyone to ask questions. He just stops answering his phone and then stops being findable. She looked at Clara directly. I am not willing to trade his life for mine. The room pressed in. Clara sat down beside her. I signed the papers, Nadia said, voluntarily in front of witnesses with a notary. Legal and binding and completely real. There is no cavalry coming, Clara. There is just tomorrow, and the day after, and learning how to be something different than what I thought I was going to be. They sat together in silence for a long moment, the kind of silence that does not need to be filled. I should never have asked you to come, Nadia said finally. I just needed one person here who actually gives a damn about me instead of the deal. I am not leaving you, Clara said. You should. Nadia stood smoothing the silk robe with both hands, the gesture of a woman reconstructing herself in real time. Go down to dinner. Do not stare at anyone. Do not ask questions. And when you meet Rocco, she hesitated. Do not look at him like you want to save me. He notices everything. Clara noticed. The rehearsal dinner was held in a ballroom that could have accommodated 200 people, but held 30. And the effect was not intimate, but rather like a performance staged in a space far too large for the audience. Everyone slightly exposed, no place to tuck yourself away from view. Crystal everywhere, candles in cut glass holders throwing fractured light across white linen. A string quartet playing Vivaldi in the corner, with the focus of people who had been instructed not to make eye contact with guests. Clara was seated near the head table and found herself beside a man who introduced himself as Stellan Vane, Rocco's cousin, with an easiness that felt like a professional skill rather than a natural trait. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, dark-haired, conventionally handsome in the way of men who have learned that handsomeness is a tool and use it accordingly. He poured her wine without asking and smiled at her with his mouth and watched her with his eyes, and there was a slight but measurable gap between the two. Nadia tells me you're an illustrator, he said. Children's books mostly. Clara looked at her wine glass. How long have you known Rocco? My whole life. He said it with the lightness of someone who had made peace with a fact that required making peace with. We grew up in the same house after my father passed. He looked after me. His gaze moved briefly across the room. He has a particular way of looking after things. Before she could follow up, the temperature changed. It happened the way certain pressures change, not all at once, but in a cascade first. The string quartet's Vivaldi dropped slightly in volume, though the players had not visibly adjusted. Then conversations shifted in register, quieter, more careful, more aware of themselves. Rocco Valenti walked into the ballroom. He was not what she had constructed in her mind from Nadia's pieces. She had imagined someone larger, more obvious, the kind of presence that announced itself with noise. Rocco was not that. He was somewhere in his late 30s, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples, and a face that would have been handsome if there had been any warmth in it. Suit the color of charcoal perfectly fitted. He moved through the room with the specific economy of someone who had never in his life needed to hurry, because the room always waited for him. He spoke to 3 people on his way to the head table. Brief exchanges, a hand on a shoulder here, a word in an ear there. Each man he spoke to straightened slightly afterward, the unconscious posture adjustment of people who have just been reminded of something important. He reached the head table. Nadia stood automatically. He kissed her cheek with the precision of a man completing a procedural step and said something Clara could not hear, that made Nadia smile with her mouth and nowhere else. Then he looked at Clara. She had been warned. She had told herself she was prepared. She was not prepared. His eyes were the color of dark water and about as warm. Not cruel, not threatening, something worse than either. Entirely empty of whatever it is that makes people legible to each other, that quality that lets you look at someone and understand even imperfectly what they want, what they feel, what they are. Rocco Valenti's eyes offered nothing. They only received. Miss Weston, he said, as though her name were a fact he was confirming rather than a greeting. Nadia speaks of you with great warmth. She thinks highly of you as well, Clara said. Her voice stayed level. She was proud of that. Loyalty between women is a valuable thing. His gaze was direct and still and slightly too long. Valuable and occasionally inconvenient. He looked at Nadia. You look lovely. He said it the way you say the temperature is 42 degrees. Then he took his seat. Stellan leaned slightly toward Clara. Do not take it personally. He assesses everyone when he meets them, looking for what they want, what they are afraid of. Did I pass? Clara asked quietly. Stellan picked up his wine glass. You did not flinch. That is a start. The dinner lasted 3 hours. Toasts were made that sounded like business communiques. Laughter happened at the right intervals and in the right volumes. Nadia played the radiant bride with a skill that Clara recognized as courage wearing a different name, and Rocco sat beside her like architecture, structural, impermanent, and cold. Clara ate almost nothing and drank one glass of wine slowly and watched and cataloged. 9 visible security personnel in the building, 3 in the corridor outside the ballroom. Guards who rotated positions on a schedule she began timing mentally. Cameras in the main entrance and the stairwell landings, but not as far as she could observe in the guest wing corridors. She was doing it without deciding to. Her brain had identified the situation and started working without consulting her. Around 11, she excused herself and made her way back through the house. Her room. She locked the door and stood with her back against it. Tried her phone again, no signal. She stood at the window and looked out at the grounds. Stonehaven's security lights threw hard white illumination across the lawn. She could see 2 men walking the fence line in opposite directions, a third stationed at the gate, a fourth at the corner of the building. She was not, she told herself, firmly in danger. She was a wedding guest at a home with unconventional security arrangements. She was going to go to sleep and wake up and stand at an altar tomorrow afternoon and watch her best friend get married, and then on Sunday she was going to get in a car and go back to Brooklyn and figure out from there how to help. She did not sleep. The wedding happened at 2 in the afternoon in Stonehaven's Grand Hall, a room with cathedral ceilings and stone walls hung with tapestries, and enough candles burning to suggest that electricity had been a mistake. 50 chairs arranged in precise rows. 50 guests, every one of them male except for Clara, and 3 women who appeared to be the companions of men who sat in the front rows with the posture of people accustomed to sitting at tables where serious decisions were made. Clara stood at the altar in the bridesmaid dress and held her flowers and watched the door. Nadia appeared on her father's arm. Thomas Harlow, a man in his 60s who had once had the look of someone who expected good things from life and now had the look of someone who had made catastrophic miscalculations and was still paying for them. His color was bad. His shoulders were forward. He did not look at his daughter when he walked beside her. He looked at the floor and then at Rocco, and then at the floor again. At the altar, he stepped back from Nadia with something that in a different context might have been relief. He found a seat quickly. Rocco waited. He had the patience of stone. The ceremony was formal and brief. Words in English and a passage in Italian that Clara could not follow, but that the front row listened to with bowed heads, the posture of liturgy. Rings exchanged with the efficiency of contractual obligation. Nadia's hands were steady during the exchange. She had decided that steadiness was the only form of dignity still available to her, and she was going to exercise it completely. "I do," she said in a voice that carried. "I do," Rocco said in a voice that contained nothing but the fact. And it was done. The reception followed immediately in the ballroom. More candles, more flowers. The string quartet had been joined by a pianist. Clara drank champagne she did not taste and watched Nadia move through the room on Rocco's arm, playing the performance required of her with every resource she had. Around 8, Clara found a side door to the garden and slipped through it. She needed air. She needed to breathe in a space where she was not being observed by men who made their observing feel like inventory. The estate grounds spread away from the house in every direction. Formal gardens close to the building, giving way to lawn, giving way to the darkness of the tree line. The night was cold in clear November in Vermont, the kind of cold that has weight to it. She walked until the sounds from the reception were a murmur behind her and stood near a stone bench by a dormant rose garden. She was still standing there when she heard footsteps and turned to find a man she had not seen inside, older than the guards, somewhere in his 60s, with a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw, and eyes that had the particular flatness of someone who had seen too many of the things people do to each other. He lit a cigarette without asking permission and stood 2 yards from her and looked at the house. "You are the friend," he said, "the illustrator from New York." "What is this place?" she said. "Really?" He took a long drag. "What do you think it is?" "Who are Rocco Valenti's enemies?" "The Carbone family," he said finally. "Out of Boston, 20 years of border wars over the ports. Providence. The Cape." He exhaled smoke into the cold air. "Rocco has held them off because he is smarter and more patient. But patience runs out." He dropped the cigarette and crushed it with his heel. "Go back inside, Miss Weston, toast the couple, leave Sunday, and forget you understood any of what I just told you." He walked away before she could respond. Clara stood in the cold garden for another minute, looking at the fence line, at the men along it, at the gate that was the only way in or out of a property she was beginning to understand was less a home than a fortified position in an ongoing war. She went back inside. By 11, she was exhausted in the specific way that comes not from exertion, but from sustained alertness. She said goodnight to Nadia, who held her hand for 2 beats longer than a social goodbye requires, and made her way to her room. She changed into pajamas. She tried her phone, no signal. She stood at the window a long time watching the rotation of the security patrol below. She counted the intervals. 90 seconds between passes at this section of the fence. 90 seconds was not enough time to do anything except confirm that 90 seconds was not enough time. She lay down, stared at the ceiling, made herself breathe slowly. Her door opened. She sat up fast, heart hammering before she was fully awake. 2 men in the doorway, large, patient, the particular patience of men who are used to people responding to their presence with fear. "Mr. Valenti would like to see you," one of them said. It was 12:47 in the morning. Clara stood. She did not let herself look for her shoes. She did not let herself look for anything that might suggest she was trying to prepare or protect or delay. She had understood in the garden, listening to the old man talk about the Carbone family and border wars, that there was a grammar to this place, and that its first rule was, do not show fear because fear is information, and information here belonged to Rocco. She followed them in her pajamas and bare feet through corridors that grew darker and quieter and colder as they descended from the guest wing into the interior of the house, past a room that smelled of gun oil and old wood, and past a door with a keypad lock that no one explained. The office at the end of the corridor was large and dark paneled and smelled of leather and old paper, and the specific quality of air in rooms where power has been exercised for a long time. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a desk that was more architectural statement than furniture. Rocco behind it in the same charcoal suit, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Sit," he said. She sat. She placed her feet flat on the floor and her hands in her lap, and kept her face the same way she kept her hands when she was drawing something difficult, steady and purposeful, and giving nothing away. Rocco looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I am going to speak plainly because it is late, and I find indirectness wasteful." She said nothing. "You spent this evening watching my security rotation." He said it with no particular inflection, just a statement of observed fact. You counted personnel. You noted camera positions. You assessed the fence line. He picked up the whiskey and held it without drinking. "I have people who notice these things. You were not discreet because you did not yet know you needed to be." "I do not know what you mean," Clara said. "Do not," he said quietly. It was not a threat. It was almost a request, the kind made between people who understand that certain forms of dishonesty are simply inefficient. "I know exactly what you mean. I know you are intelligent, that you care deeply about Nadia, and that you arrived here with the intention of understanding your environment so that you could find a way to alter it." He set the glass down. "I also know that you have no signal on your phone and no way to reach anyone outside this property without my knowledge." He leaned back in the chair, the gesture of a man who has already finished the calculation and is simply informing others of the result. "You are not leaving Sunday, Miss Weston." The room tilted. Clara felt it the way you feel the ground shift in an earthquake, that fraction of a second when everything stable reveals itself as contingent. "You cannot," she said. "I already have." He said it without cruelty, which was somehow worse than cruelty. "Your presence here is useful to me. Nadia's behavior is more predictable when someone she trusts is within reach. This makes the transition period significantly more manageable." He looked at her directly. "You will be treated well. Your room is comfortable. You will have access to materials for your work if you want them. You are not in danger." "I want to go home." "I understand." He stood, which meant the conversation was over. What you want and what is practical are two different variables. He buttoned his jacket. "Mrs. Alcott will come by in the morning with the updated arrangements for your stay. I suggest you sleep." He walked to the door, paused. "If you are thinking about Nadia, about asking her to help you, or helping you contact someone, or intervening in any way." He did not turn around. "She is carrying enough weight already. I would hate for your situation to become a burden she has to carry as well." The door opened. The 2 guards were outside. They walked her through the house to a different wing, a different room, also beautiful, also expensive. A desk with a lamp, bookshelves, a window overlooking the eastern gardens. The window glass was thick, too thick. She pressed her palm against it and felt a slight give of reinforced material, the kind that does not break the way ordinary glass breaks. The guards left, the door closed. The lock engaged from the outside with a sound that was not loud, but that Clara would remember with complete clarity for the rest of her life. She stood in the middle of the room in her bare feet and her pajamas, and she did not cry. She had learned in the third grade during a bad year that she rarely thought about anymore that crying was sometimes appropriate and sometimes it was just a way of spending energy you needed for other things. She looked at the bookshelves, at the desk, at the reinforced window. She crossed to the window and stood with her forehead against the cold glass, looking out at the security lights and the fence line and the tree line beyond it, the dark forest that began where Stonehaven's control ended, the world that was still out there, still existing, still the same as it had been 3 hours ago. She stepped back from the window, sat down at the desk, found a piece of paper in the drawer and a pen. She did not start crying. She started drawing instead, a habit that had gotten her through every difficult thing she had ever faced, the act of making something deliberate in the middle of something she could not control. She drew the fence line, the camera positions she had memorized, the rotation intervals of the security patrol, the distance from the east wing window to the garden below, the direction of the tree line. She drew it all out carefully, like the beginning of a map, like the first page of a very long story whose ending she had not yet written. But she was going to write it. She was quite certain of that, even here, even now, with the lock on the door and the reinforced glass and the 12 men she could count and however many more she could not. She put the pen down, lay down on the bed without changing, looked at the ceiling in the dark. Outside, the patrol walked its rotation, 90 seconds, 90 seconds, 90 seconds. She counted them like a pulse. The first morning, she did not eat. The tray arrived at 7, slid through a gap in the door by a woman in a gray uniform who did not meet her eyes and did not respond to questions. Scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice in a crystal glass. She left it untouched on the desk and sat on the floor beside the bed, instead back against the mattress, knees pulled up, and spent 3 hours doing the only productive thing available to her. She memorized everything. The sound of the lock before the door opened, a specific 2-part click, the outer mechanism releasing first and then the inner. The timing of footsteps in the corridor outside, 2 sets of guards rotation every 40 minutes, based on the sound of their shoes on the hardwood. The quality of light through the reinforced window across the day, which told her the window faced east, northeast. The distance from the window ledge to the garden below, which she estimated at roughly 18 feet based on the ceiling, height of the room, and the floor she was on. She drew all of it in the margins of the paper she had used the night before. Small, precise notations around her map. The habit of a person who trusted her hands more than her memory, and her memory more than her circumstances. The second day, she still did not eat. By the third day, her body overruled her principles, and she ate the toast and left the rest. On the fourth day, Stellan Vane knocked on her door. She heard his voice, first speaking to the guard outside and then the lock, and then he was in the doorway holding a stack of books and a wooden case that she recognized immediately, even from across the room, as an art supply kit. He took in her appearance without commenting on it, which she appreciated because she was aware that she looked like someone who had not slept properly in 4 days and had been spending her time sitting on floors doing math about escape routes. He set the books on the desk, set the art case beside them. "I thought these might help," he said. "The books are from the house library. The case is new." He paused. "I asked Mrs. Alcott what brands you preferred. She found your website." Clara looked at the case. It was the right brand, the right pencils, the kind she saved up for because they were expensive and worth it, and she bought herself a new set every year at Christmas as the one reliable gift she gave herself. She picked it up, put it down again. "You think this is acceptable," she said, "what he is doing?" "No," Stellan said. He said it simply, without defensiveness, the way you say a fact about the weather. "I think very little of what happens in this house is acceptable. I have thought that since I was 9 years old." He looked at the bookshelves with an expression she could not fully read. "But I survive it, same as everyone else here." "Then help me leave." His face went carefully blank in a way that was itself a kind of answer. "I cannot," he said. "Cannot or will not. Same result either way. That is not the same thing, and you know it." He looked at her then directly, and she saw something in his expression that was not indifference. Something that had been worn down to a smoothness that resembled indifference. but was not entirely. Like a stone in a riverbed that had been water once and still remembered it. Nadia is asking about you, he said. She has been told you need time to settle. He moved toward the door. I will come back if you want to talk. He left. The lock engaged. Clara stood at the desk for a long moment looking at the art case. Then she opened it, selected a pencil, sat down. She did not draw a mouse or a bear or anything with soft edges and a kind ending. She drew the window frame, the exact dimensions as best she could calculate them. The 4 bolts in the corners that held the reinforced pane in place. The gap between the frame and the wall, where the seal was slightly irregular on the lower left corner, a manufacturing imperfection she had noticed on the second day when she had nothing to do but look at things very carefully. She drew it all to scale. Then she made a note in the margin butter knife, consistent pressure, no more than 3 minutes per session. The weeks moved the way time moves when the days have no shape to distinguish them from each other. Clara developed a routine because routine was the only structure that belonged to her. She woke at 6 before the guards changed shift, drew until the breakfast tray arrived. 8. Spent the morning working on the mental map of the property, adding details as she collected them. Sounds from outside that told her about traffic patterns on the access road, the schedule of the kitchen deliveries. She could hear from her room the voices in Italian from the floor below that came and went on a schedule she was beginning to understand. Stellan came every few days. He brought books, and sometimes he sat in the chair by the window, and they talked about things that were not about Stonehaven. He had read more than anyone she had ever met, the specific voraciousness of someone who had spent years in a world with no one in it he could talk to honestly. They argued about a novel she had not finished. He told her about growing up in the house Rocco's father had run in Providence. Careful stories, edited stories, but with enough in them that she began to understand the shape of the life he had been born into and never been permitted to leave. She did not trust him, but she watched him carefully the way you watch someone you are trying to understand rather than someone you have already placed. She noticed that he never referred to Rocco by name when speaking about operational matters. He said he, or the family, or the arrangement. She filed this away. She noticed that when she asked about the kitchen schedules casually in the context of whether she might have a different kind of tea, he answered without hesitating. He did not consider the question suspicious. That was useful. On a Thursday, 6 weeks into her captivity, Rocco summoned her to his office. Nadia's pregnant, he said. The words rearranged the room. 2 months, he continued. Confirmed this morning. He looked at her with the same quality of attention he brought to everything complete and evaluating and offering nothing back. She has been asking for you. I have decided to allow limited visits. Clara kept her face still, allowed herself 1 second of pure feeling before she locked it down. Then she said, and what is the condition? He almost smiled. Not quite. The corner of his mouth moved slightly, the way a chess player's expression moves when an opponent makes an unexpected move. You understand how this works, he said. I am learning. The condition is simple. Your behavior directly affects her well-being. If you are cooperative and calm and do nothing to agitate an already complicated situation, she has access to the small comforts that make life bearable. If you become a problem, he did not finish the sentence. Clara looked at him steadily. And if something happens to the baby, nothing will happen to the baby. His voice carried a certainty that was not reassurance but statement of intent. I protect what is mine. The child is mine. There it was, stated flatly in the afternoon light. The child is mine. Not we are expecting or any of the ordinary human constructions around new life. Simply mine. A category into which the baby had been placed alongside the house and the cars and the men on the fence line. You will see her tomorrow morning, Rocco said. 1 hour. Mrs. Alcott will supervise. She was dismissed. Nadia was sitting in her suite's window seat when Clara arrived the next morning, wearing a cream sweater and looking out at the grounds with an expression Clara associated with people who have found a way to be absent while present. She turned when Clara came in, and for a moment the mask slipped, and she was just Nadia, 26 years old, 8 weeks pregnant, trapped in a stone house in Vermont. And Clara crossed the room and held her, and neither of them said anything for a long time. They talked carefully after that, aware of Mrs. Alcott in the corner chair, with her sewing and her carefully inclined ears. They talked about Clara's room and the books Stellan had brought and the meals. They talked about Brooklyn and Nadia's favorite coffee place on Atlantic Avenue. They did not talk about the pregnancy. They did not talk about what came after. When the hour ended and Mrs. Alcott rose, Nadia held Clara's hand for a moment. "I am okay," she said. "Not in the way people say it when they are okay, but in the way they say it when they have decided it is the only sentence worth saying, and they are going to keep saying it until it becomes something close to true." Clara squeezed her hand. Then she was walked back to her room. She spent the afternoon at her desk with the butter knife she had removed from that morning's breakfast tray, applying it to the lower left bolt of the window frame, with patient, minute pressure 3 minutes, and then she stopped. Wiped the knife clean, replaced it on the tray. The bolt had moved fractionally. She noted it in the margin of her map. 23 days later, she was ready. She had been systematic about it. Not reckless, not hopeful. Systematic. She had observed that the east-facing exterior wall below her window had a section of trellis running up to the second floor that would take her weight if she descended the outer ledge carefully. She had established that the security patrol had a 90-second gap at the eastern wall corner between the moment the North Patrol turned back and the moment the South Patrol came into view. She had established that the supply delivery at 3 in the morning on Wednesdays used the service entrance on the far west of the property, drawing the gate guard away from the primary entrance briefly. She had established that the east gate was monitored by camera, but that the camera had a partial obstruction from a large spruce tree that had not been trimmed since summer. She had all of it, built piece by piece over weeks, the way she built illustrations, one careful line at a time. On a Wednesday night in December, after the house had been quiet for 2 hours, Clara removed the window frame. All 4 bolts. The frame came out in silence, just as she had calculated. Cold air entered the room in a rush, shocking clean smelling of pine and frozen earth. She put on her dark coat, her boots, the small bag she had packed incrementally over 10 days. She sat on the window ledge. Below her, the garden was silver and shadow in the security lights. The patrol had just passed. She had 87 seconds. She went. The trellis held. The drop at the bottom was harder than she had calculated, her ankle turning slightly on the frozen ground, but she was up and moving before the pain registered. Across the garden to the wall, along the wall, in the shadow of the hedgerow, where the cameras did not reach. The spruce tree at the east gate ahead of her. She was 40 feet from the gate when the lights came on. Not one light, every light. The entire east face of the property erupting in white. The kind of illumination that erases shadows entirely, that makes the world flat and nowhere to hide in. Clara stopped. There were 4 men between her and the gate, more coming from the South Patrol at a jog, unhurried the movement of people executing something that had already been decided. Behind them at the gate itself, Stellan Vane stood with his hands in his coat pockets, watching her. Not restrained, not surprised, watching her with the expression of a man who had known where she would be and when she would be there. She understood it in a single moment, the way understanding sometimes arrives not as a process but as a completed fact. The books, the conversations, the questions about her habits, about what she found comforting. All of it had been information gathered carefully and delivered to someone who needed it, and she had given it because she had been lonely and starved for honest human contact, and he had known she would be. She had not been observed by accident. She had been cultivated. One of the men took her arm with a professional neutrality that was somehow worse than roughness and walked her back toward the house. She did not look at Stellan as she passed him. She looked at the gate, at the tree line beyond it, barely visible through the fence, at the road that ran north into darkness and then eventually to a highway and then eventually to everything that was not Stonehaven. Then the house swallowed her again. Rocco was in the main hall standing by the fireplace. He looked at her for a long moment. The firelight moved across his face without warming it. "You are smart," he said. "Everything you did was correct. The bolts, the timing, the patrol gaps, all correct." Clara said nothing. The sensor array along the east wall was installed 6 months ago. It does not appear on any plan of the property. He turned back to the fire. "You could not have known about it. The failure had nothing to do with your planning." "Was that supposed to be a compliment?" she said. "It was an acknowledgement. I do not give those casually." And Stellan, his face gave nothing, was watching as he was asked to watch. So all of it, all those weeks, every conversation, he was doing what was necessary, as everyone in this house does. Clara looked at the fire. The heat of it reached her face, but the rest of her was cold all the way through, the kind of cold that is not about temperature. What happens now, she said. Rocco was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the same quality it always had, informational, precise, stripped of everything that was not the fact. You are going to spend some time in the lower level of the house, he said. There are people watching this property who need to believe certain things about your situation, about whether you are a risk worth the effort of acquiring. He looked at her steadily. You need to appear broken enough that they stop calculating. She understood then, and it was worse than the cell because it meant that the punishment she was about to receive had a function beyond cruelty. It meant it had been designed. And Nadia Clara said, her privileges will be reduced while this is ongoing. He said it as a fact the world contained rather than a choice he was making. She will understand eventually that it was necessary. You are using both of us. I am managing a situation with the tools available. He moved toward the door. Mrs. Alcott will take you down. The basement room had a concrete floor and a metal cot and a light that was on at some hours and off at others on a schedule that had no relationship to day or night as Clara had previously understood them. The food was adequate and arrived once in each period of light. There were no windows. There was nothing to draw on and nothing to draw with. She spent the first day constructing the property map in her head, again every detail she had accumulated over weeks. She spent the second day doing the same and adding to it everything she had noticed during the escape attempt. The position of the South Patrol, when the lights came on, the sensor array, she had not known about the specific angle at which Stellan had been standing, which meant he had come from the interior of the house rather than the perimeter. She spent the third day thinking about the sensor array and what she knew about sensor systems and how they were powered and whether a property-wide reboot would affect them and how long a reboot would take. She spent the fourth day thinking about the kitchen. She had been through the kitchen twice during trips to the main house. She had noted three things. First, the kitchen had a separate ventilation system from the rest of the house, a large industrial exhaust stack on the western exterior. Second, the refrigerator delivery, access and a wide door on the kitchen's exterior wall was on a manual override latch from the inside. Third, the kitchen had a single camera mounted high in the northeast corner that covered the main workspace, but left the storage area and the delivery access in a blind spot. She added these details to the map in her head. On the 10th day, the door opened, and Stellan was there with a tray that was better than the usual tray, and he set it down and stood back and looked at her with an expression she now understood differently than she had before. She ate without looking at him. I am sorry, he said. She said nothing. I know what that costs, he said. I know it does not change anything. She put down the fork, looked at him. He looked the way she felt worn to something essential, the surface layers gone. You were born into this, she said. That is what you told me. Yes, and your father died in it. Yes, and you have spent every year since then doing what Rocco asks because the alternative is what happened to your father. His jaw tightened. Something moved in his eyes. So you do not get to apologize to me, she said quietly, because apologizing means you could have chosen differently and chose this instead. And if that is true, then I do not want your apology. And if it is not true, then the apology is meaningless anyway. He was quiet for a long time. Nadia has been asking about you, he said finally. Every day. She cannot sleep. How long am I down here? Another week, he said. Maybe less. After he left, she sat on the cot and looked at the wall and thought about the kitchen and the delivery access and the camera blind spot and the western exterior and the road that ran north. She thought about Nadia awake somewhere above her, unable to sleep, the baby growing in the dark warmth of her body, while the world around her made plans for both of them. She was not going to survive by making herself small and quiet and useful. She was going to survive differently. When she was returned to her room after 12 days, she was quiet and compliant, and she did not ask questions, and she ate everything on her trays, and she accepted the reduced privileges with an equanimity that she could see satisfied something in the way the household looked at her. She had understood what Rocco had told her accidentally when he explained the demonstration. She had not been meant to hear the useful part of it, but she had. The people watching this property needed to believe she was not worth the effort of acquiring. She needed them to believe that too. Rocco summoned her in January. The office again, the same desk, the same whiskey. You have a fine arts degree from Pratt, he said. Specialize in art history before illustration. She waited. I have a collection that requires professional assessment. He opened a folder on the desk. Paintings primarily, some ceramics, items acquired through transactions that do not come with documentation. You want me to authenticate stolen art. I want you to assess value and provenance. What happened before they came to me is not your concern. She looked at the photographs in the folder, a Caravaggio study, 3 canvases that might have been early American, might have been clever forgeries, a small Dutch piece that could have been remarkable. And if I do this, you will have access to the library, to proper studio space, to supervise trips to the University Archive in Burlington when assessment requires comparative material. He paused. And Nadia's privileges will be fully restored. Clara looked at the photographs. This was the calculation she had been waiting for, the moment when her usefulness became something she could trade with. She had understood it in the basement. The only currency she had was what she could do. And what she could do, it turned out, was something Rocco needed. When do I start, she said. The work was absorbing in a way she had not expected and was not entirely comfortable with. She made herself do both. Mornings in the studio space, they gave her a converted sitting room on the 2nd floor, with good north light, assessing pieces with trained eyes and the genuine pleasure of close looking that she had not accessed since Brooklyn. Afternoons back in her room at the desk maintaining the map. In February, Nadia came to find her in the studio one afternoon without Mrs. Alcott, which had not happened before. She stood in the doorway looking at the canvas Clara was examining, and for a moment they were just 2 women in their late 20s in a room with good light. How are you doing? Clara said. Nadia put her hand on the doorframe. The pregnancy was showing now, a visible curve under her loose sweater. I feel her moving sometimes, she said. In the mornings mostly. Her. I do not know, she paused. I just think of her as her. Clara set down the magnifying glass. Crossed the room. They stood together at the window looking out at the February grounds, gray and bare and cold, the security rotation proceeding with its mechanical regularity below. I need you to know something, Nadia said. Her voice was very quiet. If anything happens to me, during the birth, afterward, any of the ways things can go wrong, nothing is going to happen to you. But if it does, Nadia turned to face her. Clara, if something happens, promise me you will not abandon her, the baby. Promise me she will have someone who gives a damn about her for reasons that have nothing to do with who her father is. Clara looked at her friend, at the slight pallor and the shadows under her eyes and the particular expression of a woman who has made a decision about what matters and everything else has become peripheral. I promise, she said. Nadia nodded once. Then she touched Clara's arm briefly. The Caravaggio is a copy, by the way. The imprimatura is too even. She almost smiled. You know how long I spent looking at imprimatura in that terrible class junior year? She left before Clara could respond. In March, the first car bomb killed 3 of Rocco's men. Not Rocco. He had not been in the vehicle. The estate locked down, completely triple security, no deliveries, no external contacts. Every movement logged and reported. Clara spent the lockdown in her room and used the stillness to add to the map. She learned from the sounds that filtered through the walls that the Carbone family had escalated. She heard names she had not heard before. She heard a sound one night that she chose not to investigate, and that she later understood had been a man being questioned about loyalty in a room 2 floors below. Stellan came to her in April looking as though he had not slept in days. He sat in the chair and did not bring books or art supplies. It is getting worse, he said. She waited. Carbone has people inside. He said it looking at the window rather than at her. Rocco found 2 of them last month. He thinks there are more. The intelligence coming in says they are planning something significant. Not another warning, a conclusion. When? He shook his head. Weeks, maybe less. Clara looked at her hands. She had been at Stonehaven for 6 months. Stellan, she said, and something in her voice made him look at her directly. Are you going to tell me to run? Is this the part where you hand me a key and a map and I run into another trap? He was quiet for a long moment. No, he said. I am telling you to be ready, because when it comes, whatever it is, there will be a window. Not one I create for you, not something I arrange. Just the chaos that comes when everything falls apart at once. He looked at her steadily. I have watched you these months. You see things. You plan. You are better at surviving this than anyone I have known. And Nadia, he looked away. She is due in 3 months, Clara said. A June baby. I know. Then whatever you are not saying, she said you need to say it. He was silent for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the floor between them. Rocco has enemies on 3 sides now, he said finally, and a family that is not yet born, and a house that is becoming harder to defend. He is not a man who makes contingencies. He believes in the sufficiency of his own will. He has always been wrong about that. That was all he said. After he left, Clara sat at her desk for a long time without drawing anything. She thought about June, about a baby who would be born into this house, this stone fortress in the Vermont forest, into the custody of a man who described his unborn child as mine the way he described his property as mine. She thought about what Nadia had asked her in the studio. Promise me she will have someone who gives a damn about her for reasons that have nothing to do with who her father is. She looked at her map. At 6 months of careful observation accumulated corner by corner, like a painting built up in thin layers, each one barely visible alone, all of them together making something real. She added a new section to the map: the kitchen, the ventilation stack, the delivery access, the camera blind spot, the road that ran north. She thought about a sensor array that ran on the property's main power system. She thought about what happened to sensor arrays when power systems failed. She thought about Ren, the name Nadia had used without deciding to. Her Nadia had said, "I just think of her as her." She picked up the pencil. She wrote Ren at the top of the new page. Then she began to plan in earnest for the first time, not as an exercise in maintaining sanity, not as a way of exerting control over a situation that controlled her, but as a real and specific and executable plan for two people to walk out of Stonehaven Estate and never come back. She worked until the light failed, and then by lamplight, until she was too tired to keep the details straight. Then she lay down and she looked at the ceiling and she listened to the rotation of the guards outside, and she thought about June. 3 months. She had 3 months to finish the map. She closed her eyes, and in the dark she could see every line of it, every interval, every gap and weakness and blind spot and window, the entire structure of a place that had tried to make itself inescapable and had not quite managed it. No place was inescapable. She believed this the way she believed in the careful accumulation of small, true things into something large and undeniable. She was going to prove it. In the weeks that followed, she used every supervised trip to Burlington, every walk through the main house to the studio, every meal delivery, and guard rotation to test and refine what she knew. She was building a machine out of time and observation, each piece fitted to the next, with the precision she brought to the best of her illustration work. She thought about the sensor array constantly. It ran on the property's central power system Stellan had mentioned once in passing, in the context of a conversation about a renovation to the generator room that had nothing to do with sensors. Central power meant a single point of failure. A single point of failure meant that if the main system went down even briefly, everything that depended on it went down with it. The backup generators came on within seconds. She knew this from testing the light levels in her room on the 2 occasions when storms had knocked out power briefly in the spring. But seconds was time, and time, she had learned in 8 months of captivity, was the only currency that could not be confiscated. The carbon assault, when it came, would create exactly that window. Not because she planned it, not because she asked for it, but because violence on the scale of what Stellan had described, 20 or more men breaching a fortified position, would require a response that drew every available body toward the sound of the fighting. And every body drawn toward the east would be a body not watching the west. She also thought about Nadia, about the baby growing inside her with its complete indifference to the world it was about to enter, about the specific cruelty of being born into a house like this one, of having your first understanding of safety shaped by iron gates and men with weapons, and a father whose relationship to other people was defined entirely by what use they could be made to serve. She thought about what she had promised. In the studio in February, with the February light coming through the window and the sound of the security rotation below, the same sound every day, at the same intervals, the metronome of a life that was not a life. "I promise," she had said, and she had meant it with the specific weight of a person who has very little left to give and so gives what she has completely. She also sent the email to her mother. She had been a loud, monitored correspondent since January, the estate's way of maintaining the fiction that she was present voluntarily, that anyone who looked for her would be told she was fine traveling, taking a break. She had written careful nothing messages for months, chatty and hollow, the letters of a woman on a pleasant extended stay. In late March, she wrote something different. She had grown up with her mother constructing games for her word games and memory games, and the private language that families build without deciding to. What she wrote looked to anyone reading it who did not share 26 years of history with Margaret Weston of Portland, Oregon, like a daughter telling her mother about Vermont winters and missing home. To her mother, it was a series of very specific statements about a road junction 3 miles north of a property in Addison County, Vermont, in a Tuesday in June, in the number 3 in the word please. She did not know if her mother would understand. She did not know if her mother would be able to act on it if she did. She did not let herself think about it too specifically because hoping was a different kind of weight than planning, and she had needed all of her capacity for planning. She sent it and returned to her map and did not allow herself to wait for a reply. May came. The Vermont spring was slow and grudging cold, giving way to warmth in fits and starts, the trees along the fence line leafing out in pale green against gray sky. Nadia's pregnancy was fully visible now. She moved differently with the specific physical negotiation of a body accommodating a second person, and her face had taken on the particular quality that Clara had seen in women late in pregnancy, an inwardness, a turning of attention towards something no one else could access. Their visits continued supervised careful an hour twice a week. They talked around the things that mattered and through the things that did not, and occasionally said something real in the small gaps between. Nadia had started calling the baby Wren, not in front of Mrs. Alcott, just to Clara in the quiet moments when the guard's attention drifted. I do not know why, she said once. It just fits her. Something small and fierce. Clara wrote it in the margin of the map that night. Something small and fierce. She was ready by the last week of May. The plan was complete, every contingency mapped, every timing verified. All she needed was the window. She did not have to wait long. Wren arrived on a Tuesday night in the first week of June early, by 3 weeks in a room that had been converted into a medical suite on the second floor of Stonehaven, with equipment that suggested Rocco had prepared for this, the way he prepared for everything thoroughly and without sentiment. Clara was in her room when she heard the sounds begin. Low at first, then not low at all, the sounds of a body doing the most difficult thing a body can do, filtering through walls and floors, and the careful soundproofing of a house built to contain things. She sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed. Outside, the June night was warm. The security patrol moved in its rotation. The tree line at the edge of the property stood black against the sky with too many stars. At 11:43, the gunfire started. Not from the patrol, not from the perimeter. From the main gate, the sound of something vehicular being stopped and then not being stopped, the shriek of metal on metal, and then the specific percussion of automatic weapons that Clara had learned to identify over 6 months of listening to a house that kept weapons the way other houses kept tools. The Carbone family had chosen their moment with a precision that suggested they had known about the baby, about the distraction it would create, about the divided attention of every man in Stonehaven between the fight at the gate and the room on the second floor where a woman was in labor. Clara was already at her door when the lights went out. Not all the lights. The backup generators came on within 8 seconds. She counted them, but in those 8 seconds, the reinforced window across the room went dark, and the lock on her door, which ran on the property's central system, released with a soft, mechanical exhale that she felt rather than heard. She stood very still. Then she opened the door. The corridor was operating on backup power emergency lighting, only the orange-tinted strips along the baseboards that turned the hallway into something from a disaster film. 2 guards at the east wing entrance, but they were looking the wrong direction toward the sound of the fighting toward the gate where the Carbone assault was concentrated. Clara went the other way, toward the medical suite. She found it by the sounds. The door was ajar, the medical staff inside, too focused on what they were doing to have secured it, and through the gap, she could see Nadia on the bed, and the doctor and 2 nurses, and Wren, arriving into the world in the specific violent tenderness of birth, small and furious and absolutely real. She pushed the door open. No one stopped her. No one had the attention to spare. She stood at the foot of the bed. Nadia saw her, and her face did something complicated, and she reached out her hand, and Clara took it and held it through the last of it. Then Wren was in the room, 6 pounds and something, screaming, pink-faced and outraged at the transition from dark to light, from warm to cold, from one world to the impossible other one. The doctor placed her on Nadia's chest. Nadia looked down at her daughter. Something happened in her face that Clara had never seen before and would never fully be able to describe. The word for it was not happiness, though happiness was in it. It was closer to recognition. The look of a person who has met someone they were always going to meet. Hi, Nadia said to Ren in a voice that was barely voice at all. Hi, you. Outside, the gunfire was moving. Closer now. The Carbone assault had gotten past the outer perimeter. Clara could hear it in the corridors below, the movement of Rocco's men repositioning, the shouting in Italian that meant something was not going as planned. A burst of automatic fire somewhere on the first floor. Very close. Nadia looked up at Clara. Her face was gray with exhaustion and the terror of the noise below and the one thing underneath it that was not terror at all. Take her, Nadia said. Clara moved to take the baby. The doctor started to object, and then a sound from immediately below them, concrete and final, changed his calculation, and he stepped back. Nadia, Clara said, we need to move, both of you, right now. I cannot, Nadia said. Her voice was very steady. I cannot walk yet. She meant it literally, the practical assessment of a body that had just done something enormous and had not yet recovered its capacity. 10 minutes. Give me 10 minutes. We do not have 10 minutes. Then go. Nadia's voice did not shake. You take her and you go and you do not wait for me. That is not happening. Clara, that is not happening. The nurse nearest the door said something in a low, frightened voice and they all heard it. Then the sound from the corridor directly outside, not security, not guards, something with a different weight to it. The footsteps of men moving through a space they were taking rather than defending. The door to the medical suite had a latch. Clara crossed to it and dropped the latch. It was not much. It was what there was. She came back to the bed. Nadia had pushed herself to sitting slowly, her face white with the effort of it. She was going to stand. Clara could see her deciding to stand, her body marshaling everything it had left for one more impossible thing. She got halfway up. The shot came from the window. A single report, sharp and close, and the glass exploded inward, and Nadia was suddenly still. Clara was already moving. She caught her. Nadia's weight came down against her, and they went to the floor together, Clara's back against the bed frame, and she was looking at Nadia's face, and Nadia was looking at her, and neither of them was saying anything, because there was a moment in which words were inadequate to the fact of the world, and this was that moment. The doctor was speaking, medical words urgent and specific. The nurses were moving. Clara was holding Nadia's hand with one hand and holding Ren against her own chest with the other, the baby's small, hot weight, her screaming already quieter, as though she understood, on some cellular level, that quiet was safer. Nadia, Clara said. I know, Nadia said. No, that is not what I know, she said again. Her voice was very quiet and very clear. Her hand was still holding Clara's. Her eyes were open. She was looking at her daughter. She said, her name is Ren. She said, she is yours now. She said, do not let this be her whole world. And then she was not saying anything. The doctor was still working. Clara held Ren and looked at Nadia's face and understood that the fight at the gate and the blood on the floor and the broken window and everything that had brought her to this room on this night had been in motion since October, since a Thursday morning in Brooklyn, when a cream card arrived in the mail with gold lettering, since the moment Thomas Harlow had signed a piece of paper that sold his daughter to settle a debt. All of it had been moving toward this room, toward this floor, toward this. In the corridor outside, the latch rattled. Clara stood up. She had Ren against her chest, one arm under the baby's weight. She looked at the door. She looked at the window with its broken glass and the night beyond it. She looked at the doctor and the nurses and knew she could not take any of them with her, and that they knew it too. She looked at Nadia one last time. Then she went to the broken window and looked out, and it was the second floor, and there was no trellis this time, but there was a ledge, and below the ledge was a section of the kitchen roof extension, and below that was ground. She climbed out with Ren tucked against her body, both arms around the baby using her elbows and her back against the outer wall to control the descent. And when she dropped onto the kitchen roof, the jar went through her whole body, but she kept Ren steady, she kept her absolutely steady, and then she was off the roof and on the ground and running. The kitchen door. She had mapped it. She had spent months mapping it. The delivery access on the kitchen's exterior wall manual. Override latch from the inside. She found the door by the shape of it in the emergency lighting coming from the kitchen windows, pulled the manual lever, and was inside. The kitchen was empty. Everyone who could carry a weapon was somewhere else. She moved through the kitchen to the storage area, the camera blind spot, the ventilation stack to her left, which meant the western exterior wall was directly ahead. The delivery access door. She had never actually touched it before this moment. She had seen it twice, had measured it, by eye had confirmed from the sounds of Tuesday morning, deliveries that had opened outward on a standard commercial hinge. She found the latch. It was a heavy bar latch, industrial, the kind that required both hands. She shifted Ren to her left arm, used her right hand and her right shoulder on the bar. It resisted for one horrible second, and then it moved and the door swung out, and the night air came in warm and full of pine and smoke from the fire that had started somewhere on the east side of the property. Outside was not safe. Outside had men with guns and a family from Boston who had planned this night for months. But outside was the direction of the fence, and the fence was the direction of the road, and the road was the direction of everything that was not Stonehaven. Clara ran. She kept to the west side of the property, using the outbuildings as cover, a gardening shed, a maintenance structure moving between them in the gaps of the emergency lights. Ren was quiet now, the particular stunned quiet of a newborn who has been through too much too fast, her face pressed against the warmth of Clara's neck. The western fence was 12 feet of iron railing with pointed finials at the top. She had known this for 6 months. She had also known from watching the weekly grounds maintenance and from the delivery schedule Stellan had discussed without understanding what she was listening for, that there was a section of the western fence near the maintenance structure where 2 rails had been damaged by a fallen tree branch in March and had been braced with a temporary wooden frame pending repair that had not yet occurred. She found it. The wooden brace was rough under her hands. The gap between the damaged rails was 18 inches, maybe 20. Enough for a person, barely enough. She turned sideways, angled Ren through, first holding her, then followed the iron edge, catching her coat, tearing it, and then she was through and on the other side, and the forest was immediately around her, dark and indifferent, and exactly what she needed. She ran north through the trees away from the firelight, and the sounds of the fight Ren held against her chest with both arms, her feet finding the ground by feel more than sight. Branches caught at her hair and her face. The ground rose and fell under her. Her ankle, the one she had turned in December during the first escape attempt, sent a complaint through her leg that she noted and ignored. She ran for 15 minutes without stopping. Then she stopped behind a large pine and listened. Behind her, Stonehaven was visible as light, the orange flicker of fire and the white sweep of searchlights moving over the tree line. But the sounds were not following her. The sounds were still at the house. She looked down at Ren. The baby's eyes were open, dark, unfocused, the eyes of someone who has just arrived in the world and has not yet figured out what it is. She was looking up at the tree canopy above them, at the slice of night sky visible between the pines, at the stars that had no opinion about any of this. Clara pressed her lips to Ren's forehead, held them there for 1 second. Then she kept moving north. She reached the road junction at 2:41 in the morning by the sky, which she had learned to read during the long nights at the reinforced window, and she stood at the junction with Ren and listened to the Vermont night and waited. At 2:47, headlights appeared from the north. An ordinary sedan, 10 years old, moving slowly on the empty road. It stopped at the junction and the window came down. Her mother looked at her across the dark. She took in Clara's torn coat in her bare hands and the infant against her chest, and her face did the thing faces do when everything they feared and hoped simultaneously turns out to be true. "Get in," Margaret said. Her voice was steady. She had always been steadier than people expected. Clara got in. Her mother did not ask questions. She drove south for 20 minutes, and then west, and then north on a different road, the methodical route change of someone who had spent the past 3 months talking to people who knew about methodical route changes, and Clara sat in the back seat with Ren and did not look out the rear window. Ren slept. Clara did not. They drove through the Vermont night and into New York State as the sky began to lighten gray first and then the particular pink of very early morning, and her mother stopped at a gas station in a small town and came out with formula and diapers and a cup of coffee that she handed back without comment. Clara fed Ren with the small bottle her mother had also thought to bring, watching the baby's face as she ate the concentrated seriousness of a newborn, learning the mechanics of survival. They drove for 2 more hours and stopped at a motel outside of Syracuse, and Clara's mother got 2 rooms and paid in cash, and they went inside, and Clara lay down on the bed with Ren beside her and looked at the water-stained ceiling of a motel room in upstate New York and felt the specific texture of the world when you have gotten out of something you were not certain you would get out of. She did not sleep, but she let herself be still for the first time in 8 months. In the morning, her mother brought coffee and sat in the chair by the window, and they looked at each other. "I got your email," Margaret said. "I know. It took me a while to understand what you were asking for. Her mother's voice was careful. And then I did not know if I was reading it right or if I wanted to be reading it right and seeing something that was not there. Were you able to do it? Her mother looked at Ren asleep in the center of the motel bed, surrounded by pillows, small and utterly still. I have a friend whose son does something with private security. She paused. I did not tell him much. I told him I needed a car at a road junction in Vermont on a Tuesday night in June, and I needed to not ask or answer questions. Clara looked at her mother, at the gray in her hair that had spread since the last time they had been in the same room 8 months ago, since before a Thursday morning, in a cream card with gold lettering. I am sorry, Clara said, for all of it, for not being reachable, for the emails that must have. She stopped. Her mother looked at her with the expression Clara had been seeing her whole life, the particular quality of her mother's attention, which was the kind that did not require explanation because it had already understood. You got out, Margaret said, and you brought her. She looked at Ren. That is what matters. Clara picked up the coffee, held it in both hands. Outside the window, a gas station across the road was opening for the day, an ordinary Tuesday morning in June, the world proceeding with its complete indifference to anything that had happened in a stone house in Vermont. Tell me about her, her mother said. Clara looked at Ren. Her name is Ren, she said. Her mother was my best friend for 10 years. She was brave and funny, and she loved people in a way that made them feel like they were worth loving. She paused. She died last night, protecting her daughter. She asked me to take care of her. Her mother nodded once slowly, the nod of a woman absorbing something enormous and choosing not to diminish it by responding too quickly. Then we will take care of her, Margaret said. They drove to Portland, Oregon over 4 days. By the end of the first day, there were documents in an envelope in the glove box. Not perfect. Good enough for what they needed right now. Clara Forsyth, Ren Forsyth, a mother and a daughter from upstate New York relocating to Oregon for work. Clara held the documents in a rest stop in Ohio and looked at her new name and thought about the woman who had arrived at Stonehaven Estate in October. The woman with the sketchbook and the sensible black dress who had believed in some part of herself. She had not examined clearly that if you were careful and good and did the right things, the world would organize itself reasonably around you. That woman was gone. She had not been destroyed. She had been compressed by 8 months of concrete floors and locked doors and lost into something denser and harder and more precisely itself. She put the documents in her bag. She got back in the car. She drove west. Portland was wet in late June, the kind of rain that does not commit to being rain, but simply maintains a persistent dampness. And the apartment her mother had found for them was on the 3rd floor of a building in a neighborhood of coffee shops and bookstores and people who minded their own business, which was exactly what they needed. 2 bedrooms, a window in the living room that looked west toward a sliver of Mount Hood on clear days, a small kitchen that smelled of the previous tenant's coffee, a quiet building with a landlord who asked few questions when her mother paid 3 months up front. Clara put Ren's crib in the larger bedroom and slept on the couch for the first 2 months close to her daughter, waking at the sounds that new babies make in the night, the small, urgent communications of a person still learning the language of need. She learned the language of need too, the specific pitch of Ren's hunger cry versus her discomfort cry versus her protest at the general indignity of being new and small in a loud world. The weight of her at 3 weeks and 6 weeks and 3 months, the specific gravity of her when she slept against Clara's shoulder, the way she smelled like something clean and simple. She called Ren by her name from the first day. She had considered briefly whether to change it, whether a different name meant a different beginning. But the name was what Nadia had given her. It was the first gift her mother had been able to give her. It was not something Clara was willing to take away. She found work within 3 months. Children's book illustration freelance submitted under her new name to publishers who had not known Clara Weston. The work came back slowly at first. She did not have the softness in her line anymore, the gentle quality that had been her signature. What she had instead was precision, economy, the kind of draftsmanship that comes from months of drawing maps and calculating distances and measuring things that mattered. It turned out the field could use both. She published her first book under the new name in the spring of Ren's 2nd year. A story about a small bird who builds a nest in an impossible place, high and exposed and overlooking everything, and survives a storm that should have destroyed it because she built it the right way, one careful piece at a time. The editor called it quietly remarkable. The reviews used words like spare and assured and said the illustrations had a quality of hard-won perspective unusual in children's books. Clara kept the first copy on the shelf in Wren's room. She did not call herself Wren's mother on forms in official contexts, but in the apartment in the ordinary language of their life, the word she used was not a word at all. It was just the quality of her attention. When she looked at this child, the specific way her whole nervous system reoriented toward Wren's well-being in the manner of something that did not need a name because it simply was. Her mother stayed for the first year. Gradually, she began spending weeks in Portland and weeks in the house she had lived in for 30 years, and eventually she settled back in her own life while remaining the kind of present that a phone call and a 4-hour drive represented. Stellan Vane was arrested in August, 2 months after the night at Stonehaven. Clara read it in a single paragraph on the second page of the Portland paper. An organized crime investigation in New England. Multiple arrests. The Valenti organization being characterized as dismantled following the deaths of its leadership in what investigators were describing as an internal conflict. Rocco Valenti's name was in the third sentence. Was killed. The phrasing was passive in the way official documents are passive when the details are complicated. Clara sat with the paper for a long time at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. She thought about this man who had told her at 12:47 in the morning that she was not leaving Sunday. Who had said the child is mine with the flatness of a man who had never been taught that certain things are not categories. She thought about the envelope she had found in her coat pocket the morning after the escape, which she had not had time to examine until the motel in Syracuse. The $40,000 in the guardianship papers in the single handwritten line in the careful script of a man who had written very few things by hand in his adult life. Her mother was braver than anyone in this house. Do not tell her otherwise. She folded the newspaper and put it in the recycling bin and went to get Wren up from her morning nap. Stellan wrote her a letter from prison. It arrived forwarded through her mother, addressed to a name that was only Stellan's to know. He did not ask for forgiveness. He wrote about Rocco instead, a partial accounting of the history that had made a man who treated human beings as inventory, the Sicilian grandfather who had built the first generation of the family's power on pure brutality, the father who had refined it, the son who had inherited it and somewhere along the way calcified into it. He wrote about the night of the Carbone assault, about Rocco taking a position at the main gate with 4 men holding it, while the interior of the property was being overwhelmed, the specific tactical decision that gave the West Wing enough time to clear before the fighting moved inside. He wrote that he did not think Rocco had made that decision expecting to survive it. He wrote that this was not absolution. He wrote one more thing. He wrote that on the night of the attack, before the first shot was fired, Rocco had left an envelope on the kitchen counter with Mrs. Alcott, with instructions to place it in the coat of the woman in the East Wing if she made it out. He had known the Carbone assault was coming. He had known he might not survive it. And the last administrative act of his life had been to make sure his daughter and the woman who had promised to protect her could disappear cleanly. Not goodness, not redemption, something smaller and more precise. One man at the end of everything, choosing the right thing once in the only way he knew how, to choose anything which was quietly and without witnesses and without expecting to be thanked for it. Clara sat with that for a long time. She thought about the office at 12:47 in the morning, the desk and the whiskey, and the voice that said, "You are not leaving Sunday," with the flatness of someone reading a train schedule. She thought about the basement and the 12 days of concrete and thin light and the specific quality of that darkness, which was not the darkness of cruelty, so much as the darkness of a man who had never learned to imagine other people as fully real, who moved human beings around the board the way you move pieces, not from malice, but from the simple absence of whatever it is that makes you stop and consider the weight of what you are doing to someone. She thought about what Stellan had written about the grandfather, the father, the son. 3 generations of compression, each one inheriting not just the power, but the particular blindness that made the power possible, the inability to see the thing in front of you as something other than a resource or a threat. She thought about Wren sleeping in the next room with her small, perfect face, and her mother's laugh already beginning to emerge in the sounds she made, the particular joy that was already and entirely Nadia's alive in a person who had never met her. She thought about Rocco standing at the main gate with 4 men while everything inside fell apart. She did not know if it had been courage or calculation or something in between, some late arriving sense that certain things mattered and others did not, arrived at too late to change anything except this one last decision. She did not know if he had understood in those final minutes that the child whose name he had never said aloud, whom he had described only as mine and ours, and the child that she was going to grow up free because of what he chose to do at that gate. She suspected he had not thought of it in those terms. She suspected he had thought of it the way he thought of everything, in terms of what was necessary and what was strategic and what the situation required. And somewhere inside that calculation, at the very bottom of it, underneath all the machinery of how he had learned to move through the world, there had been something that looked in the right light from a certain angle, like love. It was not enough. It was not nearly enough. But it was what there was, and Clara had spent enough months in rooms she could not leave to understand that what there is, however small, is still worth knowing. Clara put the letter in the box where she kept the things she was not ready to decide about yet. The box sat on the top shelf of the bedroom closet, out of sight in the daily business of living. The years moved. Ren moved through them with the relentless forward motion of childhood, each phase erasing the previous one so completely that Clara sometimes caught herself mourning versions of her daughter that still existed in photographs. The round-faced baby who had not known she had survived something. The toddler who called her Kara before she could manage the first consonant, and then just kept calling her that, a name for a name, her own private word for the person who was there when she woke up and when she fell asleep, and every complicated moment in between. Clara worked and raised her daughter and lived a life in Portland, Oregon that was ordinary in all the ways she had not known to want until she no longer had them and then got them back. She had friends carefully made, the kind of friendships that develop slowly in your 30s when you have already learned which parts of yourself to protect. She had the work which continued to develop its own character, the clean, precise line, the illustrations that children responded to with more seriousness than children's illustrations usually received. She had Ren, who was not a replacement for anything that had been lost, and was not a compensation, and was not a symbol, who was simply, specifically, entirely herself, who had her mother's laugh, that particular sound Clara had heard across a decade of being Nadia's best friend, the laugh that was slightly too loud for polite company and completely uninterested in being otherwise, who had a stubbornness about her own mind that Clara recognized without being able to name its source, the look of a person who has decided what she thinks and would like the world to adjust accordingly, who asked at 17, sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, in November with coffee she was now technically old enough to drink, and a plate of toast she was ignoring about where she came from. Not the edited version, she said, the real one. Clara looked at her daughter, at the face that she knew better than her own, that she had watched become itself over 17 years of mornings at this table and nights in that room, and all the ordinary accumulation of a life built on what Nadia had asked for and what Clara had promised. She got up and got the box from the top shelf of the closet. She brought it to the table. She sat down. She told her, all of it. Vermont in October, in the cream car with the gold lettering, and a girl who was brave and bright and who had walked into a nightmare to protect someone she loved and had not been able to walk back out. The stone house and the locked door and the months of careful mapping and the night of the carbone assault in the medical suite on the second floor. And the words that had been the last words anyone had spoken to Clara that mattered in the way those words mattered. Her name is Ren. She is yours now. Do not let this be her whole world. She told her about Rocco Valenti, about the envelope, about the handwritten line, about the main gate and the four men and the decision that had not been expected to be survived. She told her about Stellan's letter and what he had written about history and calcification and the difference between explanation and absolution. She told her about the drive west and the motel in Syracuse and her grandmother's face through a car window on a dark road in Vermont, steady the steadiness of a woman who had already decided what mattered. Ren sat through all of it without speaking. When Clara finished, Ren was quiet for a long time. Then she said, she sounds like someone I would have loved. Yes, Clara said. She was. Ren looked at the box, at the papers inside it, the guardianship documents, the folded newspaper, Stellan's letter in its envelope, the photograph Clara had carried since Brooklyn, of the two of them at 22, on the roof of their dormitory building, Nadia, with her face turned up to the sun, laughing. Can I keep that, Ren asked, the photograph? Clara pushed it across the table. They drove to Vermont on a Saturday in May, the year Ren turned 18. The drive took 7 hours and they split it with a stop in Massachusetts at a diner where the coffee was bad and the pie was excellent, and Ren ate 2 slices and argued affectionately with Clara about a film they had watched the previous week, and everything was ordinary and fine. The cemetery was on the edge of a town in Addison County, small and old, the kind of place with maples along the fence and stones that dated back 2 centuries. Clara had found the record 2 years earlier through a contact who knew how to look for such things without drawing attention. The Valenti plot was in the northwest corner, modest for what the name had meant, a granite marker with Nadia's name and dates and no other inscription. They stood in front of it in the May afternoon, the air still cool enough that their breath was faintly visible, the maple above them newly leafed green and new. Wren had brought flowers, not arranged flowers, not the kind from a shop. She had stopped along the road 30 miles back and picked them from a field. Mixed wildflowers, purple and yellow and white, the kind that have no name, most people know. She crouched down and placed them at the base of the stone. Stayed there a moment, her hand resting lightly on the granite. Clara watched her daughter. At 18, at the threshold of everything, kneeling in a Vermont cemetery in front of the mother she had never known. With wildflowers, she had picked herself because that was the right thing. That was the thing that was specific to the occasion rather than generic to grief. "I think about her a lot," Wren said without turning around, "even though I did not know her. Is that strange?" "No," Clara said. "It is not strange at all." Wren stood, brushed the grass from her knees. She looked at the stone for another moment, the direct and open look of someone who has been told the whole truth and is deciding what to do with it. "She was braver than she knew she was," Wren said. Clara thought about Nadia at 26 in a champagne silk robe with hollow eyes reconstructing herself in real time. About Nadia at the window saying, "I just think of her as her." About the voice in the medical suite on a Tuesday night in June, steady, absolutely steady, saying the things that needed to be said to the person who needed to hear them. She knew exactly how brave she was, Clara said. She knew and she did it anyway. That is the whole definition. Wren nodded once. Then she turned away from the stone and looked at the cemetery and the maples and the Vermont sky and the road that ran back to the car and the highway and Portland and everything that was their life. "Ready?" she asked. Clara looked at the stone one last time. At Nadia's name in the granite, permanent and plain, and exactly what it was. She reached into her coat pocket. The letters were there, folded, the ones she had written over 18 years to a person who could not read them, all the things she had said in the dark, and at the kitchen table, and on the drive west, and every ordinary moment that had deserved witnessing by the person who was not there to witness it. She set them at the base of the stone, beside Wren's wildflowers, not to forget, not because she needed to release them in order to move forward, but because they had always been meant for Nadia, and this was the closest she was ever going to get to delivering them, and that mattered even here, even now, even after everything. "I kept my promise," she said. "She is standing on her own 2 feet, and she is going to be fine. Better than fine. She is going to be extraordinary." The maple moved above them in the May wind. They walked back to the car together. Clara and Wren Forsyth, and Clara did not look back, and she did not need to because the stone was doing what stones do, remaining holding a name in place so that it could not be entirely lost, and that was enough. Wren drove the first shift of the return trip, new license, both hands on the wheel with the concentrated attention of a recent driver who has not yet trusted herself to be casual about it. Clara sat in the passenger seat and watched the Vermont landscape move past and thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a thing she had earned the ability to think about nothing in particular, to let the mind rest on the surface of the ordinary world without needing to map it or measure it or plan a route through it. They did not talk much on the drive, not because there was nothing to say, but because they had over 18 years developed the particular fluency of people who have lived closely enough together to communicate in the silences between things. Wren drove with her window cracked, despite the cool air, the way she always did, and the smell of Vermont spring came through green and cold, and carrying something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite peace, but was in the general territory of both. At one point, somewhere in New Hampshire, Wren said, "I want to learn more about her, what she was like before all of it, before Vermont." Clara thought about Nadia at 19 with paint on her hands, arguing passionately about a lithograph technique in a classroom where everyone else had gone to lunch. Nadia at 23 throwing her head back at something only she found funny and not caring at all that she was the only one laughing. Nadia at 26 in a silk robe with hollow eyes, still herself, still completely and stubbornly herself even there. She was very funny, Claire said. She had opinions about everything, and she was usually right, and she knew it and did not pretend otherwise. She loved bad movies and good food, and she had a habit of arriving places 15 minutes late and acting like everyone else was early. She paused. She would have driven you crazy sometimes. She would have been your favorite person. Ren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me more. We have 5 hours." So Clara told her. All the small things she had not known she remembered until she started speaking the texture of a friendship built across a decade of ordinary days. The coffee orders and the borrowed scarves and the arguments and the reconciliations and the particular shorthand that accumulates between two people who have been paying attention to each other for long enough. She talked until her voice was rough and Ren had taken the highway exit toward Massachusetts and the diner with the bad coffee was visible ahead. She talked until Nadia was not a tragedy anymore but a person. Specific, irreplaceable, alive in the telling, the way people become alive when someone who loved them refuses to let them be only a loss. Outside Portland it started to rain, the familiar persistent Oregon rain, and Ren turned on the wipers and the radio, and they came into the city in the late afternoon light, gray and green and wet home. That night after dinner, Claire went to her room and opened the sketchbook she kept on her bedside table, and she sat on the bed and drew. Not a map, not a fence line or a camera position or a patrol rotation. She drew Ren's face, the look she had had crouching at the stone, her hand on the granite, the expression of someone meeting something difficult with complete attention and no flinching. She drew it carefully, the way she drew everything. One precise line at a time, the accumulation of small, true things into something large and undeniable. She looked at it for a while when she was done. Then she turned to a fresh page and drew Nadia. Not the Nadia of the medical suite or the Nadia of the champagne robe or the Nadia of the last 8 months, but the Nadia of the dormitory rooftop at 22, face turned up to the sun, laughing at something the photograph had not captured. Laughing the way she always laughed with her whole body, and no apology for the volume of it. She drew her from memory. She had not needed the photograph to know the angle of the jaw or the way the light caught the edge of her hair, or the specific quality of that laugh, open and unstoppable. The laugh of a woman who knew what she thought and felt and wanted, and did not see why any of that should be quieter than it was. She drew it carefully. She drew it true. When she was done, she sat with both pages open side by side. Ren and Nadia, daughter and mother. The line between them invisible but absolute. The connection that ran through everything Clara had become in the years between Vermont and this room on this wet night in Portland. The connection that was not blood, but was its own kind of permanence. She looked at it for a long while. Then she closed the sketchbook and turned off the light and lay in the dark in her room in Portland, Oregon, listening to the rain on the window, which was an ordinary window in an ordinary apartment where the locks were on the inside and the key was hers. She was 43 years old. She had been 26 when she arrived at Stonehaven Estate in October and thought she was going to a wedding. She had lost 8 months to a locked room and everything those months contained. She had lost her best friend on a June night when the world was otherwise going about its business of being large and indifferent. She had also built something from the inside of that loss carefully, a piece at a time, the way you build anything that matters without being entirely sure it is going to hold until it does. She had built it out of the same materials she had always used: observation and patience, and the willingness to look at things clearly, even when clarity was the last thing that felt safe. She had built it the way she built her maps in the early months, in the margins of whatever paper she could find, small and precise, and invisible to anyone who did not know what they were looking at. A life, a daughter, a self. Outside, the rain came down on Portland, and the city went about being itself loud and ordinary, and full of people who did not know about stone houses in Vermont, or a woman named Nadia Harlow who had been braver than the situation required. Inside this room in this apartment, on this wet May night, Clara Weston, who was Clara Forsyth, who was the woman who had gotten out and stayed out and raised a daughter and built a life and kept every promise she had made in the dark, let herself be still. And the stillness was real this time. Not the stillness of a person counting the patrol intervals, not the stillness of someone conserving energy for what came next. The genuine article. The kind of stillness that means you have arrived somewhere and the somewhere is enough. She closed her eyes. She slept.